Weed tea. Does it really work? Can you use weed tea instead of fertilizer to grow plants? Is it any better than just plain water? Those are the questions I'd like to answer in this program. I decided to run a little test to see how well it grows some lettuce plants indoors under lights. Now, before I describe that test to you, let's talk about weed tea. What is it? Well, it's a simple process that any gardener can use, and I'm seeing more people promote it online. What you do is you collect some weeds from the garden. It doesn't really matter what it is. So dandelions, quackgrass, whatever you happen to have, you collect it up, put it in a container, put in some water, and let it sit. Every day or so, come along, give it a stir. Those weeds start to decompose, and in theory, they release nutrients into the water. Now, one thing that does happen is that there's some reactions between the microbes and the weeds, and boy, this thing starts stinking. That's just a horrible smell. But that means it's working. After a period of time, and nobody really agrees on what that should be, but most people seem to use around 2 weeks. You harvest the tea. You take the liquid away from the weeds. You throw the weeds away and use the liquid, and that's your fertilizer. Now, some people claim that the real value of this fertilizer is in the microbes, and other people claim, well, it's the nutrients. Now, in this test, we're really going to test the power of the nutrients because it's an indoor test, and I'm not trying to keep the microbes alive in real soil. Let me describe the experimental setup I used. I took 3 containers and filled them with Promix BX. That's a soilless mix that's peat moss based. It has a little bit of perlite in there and a very low level of fertilizer. I then planted 3 seeds from a lettuce called Prize Head. It's a pretty common lettuce. And I planted those seeds into each container. Once they germinated, I cut off the extra ones. I wanted 1 seedling per container. The containers went under grow lights, and they went right beside my Streptocarpus, so they're getting a fairly good level of light. I also put them in the center of the light, so all 3 containers were getting exactly the same amount of light. I watered all containers with rainwater the first time. After that first watering, I treated each container a little differently depending on the test I was doing. Each time I watered, I gave each container 60 mils of water, or the mixture that I was testing. So I treated these containers as similar as I possibly could. The only difference was the material that I was using for the watering. In my first sample, I used just plain rainwater. That was my control. In the second one, I used weed tea that was diluted 1:10 with rainwater. And by the way, when I made the weed tea, it was also made with rainwater. The third container got rainwater along with a standard fertilizer called Master Blend. And I used the lettuce formula, which is their standard formula. This is actually a fertilizer that's used for hydroponics, and it has all the nutrients in it, including magnesium and calcium. Now, the NPK ratio of this fertilizer is about 4:3:7. So a little bit more nitrogen than the phosphorus and quite a bit more potassium. I just left the containers under lights, watered them whenever it's needed, and that was about once a week. And I just compared their growth. I wanted to see what the effect of these different watering solutions are on the growth of the lettuce. And here are my results. So this is my control. All it received was water. Now, admittedly, the plant grew better than I expected because, remember, water doesn't have any nutrients in it. But if we think about this a little bit, it actually did get nutrients. First of all, the rainwater is not really pure. As it falls through the sky, it picks up some nutrients and dirt and dust, and that has nutrients in it. In particular, it picks up nitrogen and sulfur from the air. Then it lands on the roof and collects bird droppings or mouse droppings, whatever happens to be on the roof. In my case, I'm sure there's some squirrels up there. And that gets washed down into a rain barrel. So the rainwater is fairly pure, but it does have a low level of nutrients in it. The plant's growing quite well. It looks quite healthy. So it's done a pretty good job. Now, how does that compare to the weed tea? Well, this is the weed tea. The leaves look very similar. There's perhaps a bit more red coloration, but the thing you obviously notice is that this plant is much bigger than my control. What this tells me is that weed tea had more nutrients in it than the control, than the rainwater. And that's what we would expect. We would expect nutrients to come out of those weeds into the water, and then that's what I'm using to water with. I mean, that's why people make weed tea. It looks like a very healthy lettuce and is growing quite well. Now, how does that compare to the fertilizer? Well, here's the fertilizer. This plant is almost twice the size of the weed tea plant, and it's much larger than the control. Coloration is about the same as the other two plants. The red coloration is deeper on the weed tea and the fertilizer than the control, but other than that, the leaves look about the same except for the size. Now, this was a little test. It certainly wasn't a scientific experiment. I only had the 3 lettuces. If I was doing a scientific study, I would have had many replicas, and then I'd make some measurements of actual leaf sizes and then do some statistics on those numbers. So this isn't very scientific, but I tried very hard to treat all the plants the same except for the one variable, the solution used to water them. There's a fairly big difference between the 3 plants. So I think it's safe to say that the fertilizer produced the largest plant. The weed tea did much better than just rainwater. So it was a good second choice. So is weed tea a good option for you? Well, you've seen in this experiment that fertilizer is certainly much better. Now, you do have to buy the fertilizer, whereas the weed tea is free, except for your time in actually making it. The real problem with weed tea is that you don't know what's in it. You don't know what the ratio of nutrients are. In fact, you don't even know how many nutrients you have. If you go online and look for recipes on making weed tea, you find a wide variety of recipes. Some don't dilute it at all. Other people dilute it 50-50. In my case, I diluted at 1 to 10, which is probably the more common dilution ratio. So you have about 10% of the weed tea in here. The rest is water. And then there's the variable of the actual weeds that are used. I mean, all weeds aren't exactly the same, although they're pretty similar. Weeds with soft leaves are going to decompose faster than weeds with stiff stems. The amount of weeds that you use will affect the amount of nutrients in the tea that you make. So there's lots of variables. And that's one downside with weed tea. You really never know what you've got. Could be a good batch, could be a bad batch. The other potential issue is that weed tea is made anaerobically. So we just let it sit there. And the smell tells you that it's anaerobic. The problem with anaerobic conditions is that that's a perfect place to grow pathogens. Remember the recalls for lettuce? Well, those were a result of pathogens that somehow ended up on the leaves of that lettuce. So here we're growing a batch of potential pathogens in an anaerobic condition, and then we water our plant with it. And we don't know if they're there or not. That may not be a big problem, provided you wash these leaves really well. But one of the things I like about growing lettuce indoors is that I just harvest the leaves. I don't even wash them. I don't have to worry about contamination from my fertilizer solutions. But I'm a little more cautious about using weed tea. Now, which method would I use? Well, I actually prefer using proper fertilizer. I know what I'm adding. I know what the amounts of the nutrients are. I can select a fertilizer that works really well, and it produces the largest plant in the shortest amount of time. There's a reason why commercial growers use fertilizer instead of weeds. They know what they're going to get. It's a reliable result. It does cost a little bit more, but the cost is pretty small for fertilizer. Now, if you're interested in understanding fertilizers better, have a look at this video right here. It goes through a whole list of fertilizer myths. And by following my advice, you will save money. Happy gardening.